Welcome, everybody, to a special episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. Today is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. It is the 9th day in the Jewish month of Av, the day where not one, but both Jewish temples were destroyed, the first one by the Babylonians and hundreds of years later by the Romans. And it is a day that many calamities have befallen upon the Jewish people. But of course, the major one is the destruction of the temples and the fact that not only did we lose our holiest place, but the Jewish people were decimated, massacred, and exiled, and we lost sovereignty in our homeland. Today, we are going to be talking about a current issue regarding Jerusalem. And even though we are back here, we have rebuilt Jerusalem, we are resettling our ancestral homeland, including in Judea and Samaria, there are still current dangers to our eternal and undivided capital with the unfortunate new partnership of a Biden administration in the United States and a mixed up conglomerate government here where you in a sense have a right-wing prime minister, Naftali Bennett, but with very much a very left-wing agenda, foreign policy run by Yair Lapid. And we're going to be talking with Alex Traiman, editor at jns.org, where he just posted an article titled, "Will Bennett Allow U.S. to Roll Back Recognition of Israel's Capital and Re-Divide Jerusalem?" Folks, as you know, social media censorship is growing. The best way to support our video work for Israel is to subscribe to our video newsletter on pulseofisrael.com and to share our videos. If you are already a subscriber, then thank you. So let's bring in Alex Traiman. I'm trying not to say hi or shalom, Alex, because we're forbidden from greetings on this extremely sad day. So without saying shalom, thank you so much for joining the program today to be able to talk about Jerusalem, since it is so central to our thoughts on this very sad, but hopefully one day very joyous day. Not this year, hopefully next year.
Well, it is important to be with you.
You know, even before jumping into your article, I want to delve in with you, like, the current political situation or sociological political situation in Israel that allowed us to be where we are today with regards to the danger that you write about, the potential U.S. with Israeli recognition of dividing Jerusalem. Because, again, the 9th of Av is a day where we mourn the destruction of Jerusalem, and it came about because of divisions within the Jewish people. And it's important that people be reminded, well, what happened today? How do we have this crazy government of a right-wing prime minister, but in a sense with the far left and the Muslim Brotherhood as part of the government? And it's all because of a deep hatred, not just towards Bibi Netanyahu, who was Israel's prime minister for over a decade, but for everything he represented, and a whole agenda-driven item by Israel's elite and the media for more than 2 decades, which was really against him in developing this hatred. So here, once again, we're in a situation where Jerusalem, in a sense, might be on the chopping block for the same reasons of internal division that, in a sense, brought about our destruction 2,000 plus years ago. Any of your own thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's important to note that even though there is a right-wing prime minister, as you correctly alluded to, this is as far left a government as you could possibly form in Israel. This government has every single member of Israel's left wing and includes an Islamist party. So for Naftali Bennett, who's now this supposedly right-wing prime minister, for him, it was better to sit with the entire Israeli left and a sister party of the Hamas party in Gaza than it was to sit with Benjamin Netanyahu and the religious parties in Israel.
Yeah, and just saying that the way you said it is very much connects this political issue of the day that we're talking about to the whole purpose, the reasoning behind why we are fasting and mourning today for the loss of the temples.
And I think it's also important to note that the same forces that pushed Trump from office in the United States and the same forces that pushed Netanyahu from office here in Israel are progressive forces. And these progressive forces, not only do they have values that are antithetical to authentic Jewish values, but worse yet, they are creating a replacement theology where they're actually convincing many Jews, and even, let's say, a majority of Jews in America, and certainly a portion of Jews in Israel, that progressive values are in fact Jewish values, right? That social justice is tikkun olam, and therefore these are Jewish values, right? So they'll tell you that promoting LGBTQ inclusion is social justice, and that's tikkun olam, and that's a Jewish value, even though in the Torah it does not refer to these types of things as Jewish values at all. In fact, the Torah is very, very, very strict about how it deals with such issues. So it would be one thing if Jews, whether in the United States or in Israel, would say, listen, I don't keep Shabbat, I don't keep kosher. A lot of these authentic Jewish values don't really speak to me, and I like this other set of values, which is these liberal values, Western values, progressive values. That would be one thing. But now that you have people telling you that these values, in fact, are Jewish values, and that you're not being a good Jew if you're not adhering to liberal and progressive and Western values, that's another very, very deep level that I think requires some degree of introspection, especially on a day like Tisha B'Av.
100%. And just to further that point, what some people are missing is that this progressive value system, which is all based on a concept called intersectionality. So once they're calling these progressive values Jewish values, well, if the Jewish value is to support Black Lives Matter and all the anti-Semitism that movement supports, well, and it includes calling out the Jewish state of Israel and being against the Jewish right to have their own homeland in their ancestral homeland. And so if you're not against Israel, then you're against your Jewish identity. It's to that level of insanity.
And you would suppose that progressive Jews in America would latch on to this movement of intersectionality and to try to throw Israel into the movement of intersectionality, to say, hey, here is an indigenous peoples that colonizers had removed from their land, not once but twice, right? Destroyed their temple, right? And now, this is the only example of an indigenous people actually returning to its land and restoring its ancient language and its ancient customs in its ancient homeland. We should be the example of intersectionality. We should be the progressive cause. We should be the model for what should be done in all different nations around the world where indigenous peoples were removed, and say, look at Israel. This should be the beacon, but instead, we're actually tossed into the dumpster, and we're left out of the intersectionality movement, accused of apartheid, accused of occupation, even accused of genocide. The Jewish people are actually really bad at genocide historically. We're always on the other side of it. We're never on the oppressive side of the genocide. So what you see is that there's actually no truth in these progressive pushes, but they're rather movements which are meant at really undermining Western culture itself. And if the United States will drop the banner of morality that it picked up in the wake of World War II, in the wake of the worst genocide that we've seen against the Jewish people, in which 2/3 of our people were destroyed, right, in gas chambers. That was a real genocide, and this state of Israel came about from the ashes of the gas chambers, right? And so what you see is that this progressive movement doesn't care about truth at all, and that the values, there's really, what I've seen is that there's only one progressive value at all. And that progressive value is to always be identified as a progressive, right? That's the only progressive value that there is. And the value, oh, I'm sorry, what I meant to say was that the whole point of this movement is to undercut the Western values and the Western strength. And these people know that if the United States will drop that banner, that it's this modern state of Israel that could raise up and grab the banner. And they know that. And they don't want this state of Israel to grab that banner. And that's why, while they're taking themselves down with this cultural intifada that they're doing against their own nations, that they're also doing it against the state of Israel.
Right, 100%. You know what? And I want to add in a clarification for people who might not know this, all the information, because you mentioned how the state of Israel came in after the horrendous Holocaust. And unfortunately, too many people mistakenly believe, and this is also part of the progressive lies against Israel and the Jewish people, saying, oh, the Jewish state only exists because of the Holocaust. Without the Holocaust, the Jewish state wouldn't have existed, and we have no right to this land, and now we're doing bad things to this fake historic people called Palestinians. And the people mistaken the fact that it was already back in the beginning of the 20th century, the Balfour Declaration, where the British monarchy that was in charge of the land of Israel, which was called the Mandate of Palestine, set out the Jewish homeland in this land for the Jewish people, who this is their ancestral homeland, 30 years before the Holocaust. So there's no connection between the Jewish people's right to this land, the international community's decision to allow the Jewish people to return and be sovereign in their homeland, and the Holocaust.
Right. So, I think it's also important to note that that aside from the Holocaust, that close to 1 million Jews were ethnically cleansed from the countries where they lived in the Middle East. Almost every single last one of the Jews living in all of these countries in the region were expelled from their countries, and they were forced to come to Israel, which was the only country in the world that was willing to accept them, right? So you've got, on the one hand, this mass genocide which took place in Europe, and you have this ethnic cleansing which took place against us, in Muslim nations, and yet here we get accused of ethnically cleansing Arabs from the Jewish state and committing genocide against them. And when neither of those are true. So you just see that they take what actually happens to us, flip it on its side, and say that we're the ones that are doing it, and we've got to contend with that. And today you see that all the battles that are taking place are really battles of information, misinformation, and public opinion. And for decades, we've already recognized this, but we've been unable to contend, with this deception, and we're still suffering from it.
Right. So going into your article, again, titled, Will Bennett, referring to current Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, will Bennett allow the United States to roll back recognition of Israel's capital and redivide Jerusalem? What is the premise of your article?
Well, basically, the state of Israel reached a tremendous diplomatic gain in the previous administration when former President Donald Trump officially recognized that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel and took the decision to move the embassy of the United States from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It's very important to note that this decision was not one that Trump took out of an executive order by any means. That this was a bipartisan law, the Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995, which was a bipartisan act. I think it passed in the Senate by a vote of 97-3. And some 380-something congressmen voted in favor, with only 30-something voting against. This act actually recognized. It's very important to look at the text of the act, because the act acknowledged in its preliminary findings that between the period of 1948 and 1967 that Jerusalem was a divided city, and that in the Six-Day War of 1967 that Israel reunified the city of Jerusalem, and that since 1967 the city of Jerusalem has been a united city under Israeli administration, and therefore the Congress in 1995 determined that the United States must recognize Jerusalem as an undivided city, that it should always remain undivided, and that the capital, the embassy of the United States should be moved to Jerusalem no later than 1999. However, the act did give a stipulation allowing a president of the United States to delay the implementation of that act for a period of 6 months based on security concerns, national security concerns of the United States. And so every president from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush to Barack Obama continued to sign that waiver every 6 months. That waiver would come before the president of the United States, and the president would sign the waiver, delaying the implementation of this Jerusalem Embassy Act. And in December of 2017, when the act came before Donald Trump, he simply refused to sign it. And by refusing to sign it, by U.S. law, passed in bipartisan fashion, the embassy had to move, and the United States officially recognized Jerusalem as the capital. Now, when when the United States moved the embassy, there was two things that had to happen. First, they had to physically move the building of the embassy to Jerusalem, and then they also had to secondarily move the residence of the U.S. ambassador to Israel to the same city. Now, the United States had two significant buildings in Jerusalem. One, which was the consulate, just a couple of meters from where I'm sitting right now, actually a couple hundred meters rather, from where I'm sitting right now, in the Arnona neighborhood of Jerusalem, a fairly new and large consulate building, and also a historic building on a grown street in the middle of downtown Jerusalem, in the western sections of downtown Jerusalem, that dated back to 1844. I'll talk about that building in a second, but basically what the Trump administration decided to do was to turn this consulate in Arnona into the embassy, and to turn this building on a grown street into the residence of the ambassador. Now, this consular residence on a consular mission on a grown street, as I mentioned, was established in 1844, which predates the founding of the modern state of Israel by over 100 years. And that mission was meant to provide consular services to Americans, mostly Christian pilgrims, who were in Israel at the time. Now, with the formation of the creation of the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s, the consular mission became a sort of de facto mission to the Palestinian Authority that was created at that time. And so all the U.S. representation to the Palestinian Authority took place out of that mission, and that mission acted independently of the U.S. Embassy to Israel, so that mission had a direct link to the State Department and bypassed the U.S. ambassador to Israel. So what David Freeman did, and he was the ambassador of the United States to Israel at the time of this announcement in 2017 and the move of the embassy in 2018, was to actually shutter that consular mission and to say, I think very correctly, that the ambassador to Israel should be the one that deals with both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, because they share territory. And he opened up a Palestinian Affairs office within the embassy. Now, the Palestinian Authority boycotted that office, and they were very upset that the consular mission was shut. And Federica Mogherini, the former foreign minister of the EU at the time, she noted that closing that consular mission was basically removing Palestinian claims to the city of Jerusalem. And that is the reason why the Palestinians started boycotting the Palestinian Affairs Office in the embassy, because they seek Jerusalem as a capital for a Palestinian state. They want the city of Jerusalem to be divided or to be internationalized in some capacity, not to be exclusively under Israeli authority, and they seek it to be a capital. So even though now you have some 35 different representative missions, consulates, whatever they're called, to the Palestinian Authority in the cities of Ramallah and in the city of Bethlehem, Beit Lechem. The Palestinians want the mission reopened because they want to stake a claim to Jerusalem as their future capital. Now, the Biden administration has been essentially rolling back every single one of the Trump policies in Israel and in the greater Middle East. And we can talk about that also if you want, but maybe you have some questions about what I've said so far.
Well, I actually just learned something last night that I wanted to ask you about. Someone mentioned that there is an international law that any city that has an embassy cannot have a consulate from that same country. So in essence, if the Biden administration does open a U.S. consulate in Jerusalem while the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, you're talking about the Biden administration going against international law. I haven't heard anything about this. Is that true? And do you know if that's being brought up at all?
I mean, there's definitely questions about, okay, do you call it a consulate? Do you call it a diplomatic mission? Right? Like at present, the old embassy to the state of Israel, the old U.S. embassy in Tel Aviv, has now become a branch office of the embassy that currently sits in Jerusalem. So there's probably ways to play around with the language, but I think what is very important to note, and this is why I entitled the article, Will Bennett allow the division of Jerusalem, is that the sovereign state, which is Israel, would need to permit the United States in order to open up a consular mission to the Palestinians anywhere in Jerusalem or anywhere in Israeli territory for that matter. I interviewed David Freeman a few months back, and he clarified to me that when the United States wanted to move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that they had to actually receive written permission from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order to move their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So the host state has to provide permission. Now, whether it's called a consulate or a diplomatic mission or whatever that is, there could be legal implications of that. I think there's probably many cases where the embassy building itself in a country might not be the building that performs consular services, right? So, you could have multiple installations of an embassy in a different place, in a place, including providing consular service, right? A consulate provides consular services, passports, birth certificates, visas, things like that. So that might not take place at the building that is actually called an embassy.
And can you explain why the step of the United States, the Biden administration, reopening this closed consulate, which in a sense was basically just an office so that the State Department can have a direct foreign policy with the Palestinian Authority from Jerusalem, why that is a step towards America recognizing redividing Jerusalem, as opposed to people saying, no, they're just opening a consulate. That's not them necessarily accepting the redivision of Jerusalem.
Right, because as I mentioned, there's many countries that have representative missions, diplomatic missions, consulates, embassies, whatever they want to call it, to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, which is the seat of government of the Palestinian Authority. Right, so if the United States wanted to have a mission specifically to the Palestinian Authority, I think there's a good argument that could be made that they can have direct relations with the Palestinian Authority that doesn't have to go through Israel. I mean, of course, Israel and the Palestinian Authority are hostile toward one another. So it does make sense in a way to have separate diplomatic relations with the Palestinian Authority than with Israel. But you do that in the city, which is the capital. The same reason why the United States decided in 2017 and 2018 to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Donald Trump said at the time, it is simply a recognition of reality, that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. Now, the United States, to this point, does not recognize a sovereign state of Palestine, right? They do not recognize that the Palestinian Authority is a state of any kind. They do recognize that there's a state of Israel, and now they recognize that the capital of that state is Jerusalem. And that is a long overdue move. It should have been done in 1948, and it should have been done before 1999, like the Bipartisan Congressional Jerusalem Embassy Act mandated. But Trump righted historical wrong, and he decided that he was not going to allow the lie to persist any further, and he moved the embassy. And so if you want to open up a mission to another entity, and that entity has its capital in Ramallah, so you open up the office to that place, in the place where the parliament and the chairman or the president of that entity sits, and that's in Ramallah. And if you want to do it in Jerusalem, the only reason why you do it in Jerusalem is because the Palestinians want to claim the city as a capital for a Palestinian state, and that the United States does not want to favor Israel in the battle for Jerusalem, and therefore they want to even the score and put their own diplomatic mission to the Palestinians in Jerusalem to say that this issue has not been solved, that is a final status issue that must be negotiated between the parties, and they acknowledge that they propose that Jerusalem may in fact end up being the capital of a Palestinian state. And this is the reason why Israel must refuse to open up the office.
And before going to the Israel side, which I'd love to hear your feedback on, you write in your article, you quote Dory Gold, right, the director of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, explaining that if the United States would open up this consulate office to service the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem, then it is a chain reaction. And I'm quoting Dory Gold from your article. The threat is not just that you are potentially rolling back a major diplomatic gain, but even more importantly, that you will not be able to move forward and build on that diplomatic achievement. If you want to get more countries to recognize Jerusalem and move their embassies to Jerusalem, then opening a consulate to the Palestinians there sends a signal that they have doubts about the Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem and can cause other nations also to move their offices for the Palestinian Authority to Jerusalem, leading to a chain reaction. When it comes to Jerusalem, there can be no messing around.
Exactly. You know, so Israel's now been a place where it's been trying to convince other countries to move their embassy to Jerusalem, right? So we know that Guatemala moved its embassy to Jerusalem just days after the United States did it. And quite recently, Honduras announced that it had moved its embassy to Jerusalem. There's other countries that may do the same. Brazil was considering potentially moving its embassy to Jerusalem. Not only does this potential move to open up a Palestinian consulate here in Jerusalem put the brakes on what was already a difficult process of getting countries to acknowledge that Jerusalem is in fact Israel's capital. But you might have other countries saying, hey, we also want to move an office to the Palestinians to Jerusalem. Or they might turn around and say, okay, listen, we would be willing to open up an embassy to Israel in the western side of Jerusalem, and we also want to open up a consulate to Palestinians on the eastern side of Jerusalem. So you could actually wind up having like an embassy row, so to speak, to the Palestinians in Jerusalem.
And it is so scary to think that we have a government that might give permission for this to take place. And your thoughts, does Bennett, as Prime Minister, in this government where in essence it's Lapid running foreign policy, so we don't even know how much of a say Bennett has on this, or he just gave a blank check to Lapid to be able to make foreign policy decisions. 50-50, 90-10, what are your thoughts on whether this is actually going to happen, that our own Israeli government is going to allow this to happen?
Well, you know, if Yair Lapid was the one making the decision by himself, I think it would be 100%. He would do it, right? Lapid, it should be noted that the mandate to form this government absolutely did not belong to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett has the 5th or 6th largest party in this government, and even Lapid's party is only...
With only 6 seats. Out of a 61 coalition, only 6 seats. He's the prime minister.
Well, right. I mean, his party came into the government with 7 seats. I think that was the 5th or 6th largest party in the coalition. Even this is not the largest party even in the coalition. That, you know, Lapid with 17 mandates had the largest party in the government. Of course, that party was 13 seats smaller than the Likud party, the previous reigning party of Israel. So Lapid himself had a mid-sized party. Bennett has a small-sized party. He received just barely 5% of the total vote in the country just to get into the Knesset, and fell, always third or fourth in the secondary polls about who you would pick to be the prime minister. But Lapid, who is he positions himself as centrist, but it's kind of ironic because he's a centrist that holds left-wing views, and his first political partners were the far left partners that he would. So you have Yair Lapid, who's a left-winger, who has his chief strategist is Mark Mellman, who runs a he's a Democratic Party pollster, basically, a longtime Democratic Party pollster. And you have a very aggressive Biden administration led by Secretary of State Blinken, which seeks to reverse all of the policies that the Trump administration put forth, both for Israel and for the rest of the Middle East. So with regard to Israel, so what did the Trump administration do? So first, it moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and recognized Jerusalem as the capital. It said it recognized Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. It said that settlements were not necessarily illegal under international law. That was a major policy switch. Also defunded the Palestinian Authority, defunded NGOs that were assisting the Palestinian Authority, like UNRWA, which is the one that writes the Palestinian textbooks and funds schools to the Palestinian Authority. The United States shuttered the diplomatic mission to the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Washington, D.C. So they really turned the tables, on the Palestinian Authority. And then if you look a little bit wider, the Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, Iran nuclear deal, and sanctioned the Iranian regime harder than any other country in the world has ever been sanctioned. And then the next thing that they did was that they incentivized moderates in the Middle East to make peace or normalization agreements with the state of Israel. And they did that with a tremendous number of financial incentives and defense incentives. For example, sending, promising to sell F-35s to the United Arab Emirates. And so the second that the Biden administration came into office, first they said, well, let's question those sales of F-35s to the Emirates, right? And essentially slammed the brakes on the Abraham Accords moving forward. The Trump administration had said that there was between 5 and 10 other countries that were potentially lining up to sign normalization agreements. So the Biden administration has slammed the brakes on that process.
And I just want to add another thing that they did to slam the brakes on that process. The Trump administration set up a special Abraham Accords fund with billions of dollars to help fund joint projects between Israel and the Arab Muslim world. And basically, the Biden administration stopped it. So everything that was done to help bring strengthen peace and develop even peaceful relations with more moderate Arab Muslim countries, the Biden administration basically stopped in its tracks.
Yeah, in one sentence, what the Trump administration did was to remove funding from malign actors and to instead incentivize moderates to make peace with Israel. So what the Biden administration did, the first thing they came into office was to reverse the flow of the funds and say, hey, we're going to stop incentivizing moderates to make peace with Israel, and we're going to return funding to malign actors. Now, when Benjamin Netanyahu opposed the Iran nuclear deal, he famously marched into the Congress in 2015 and gave a speech to a joint sessions of the Congress openly opposing the deal. And Democrats said that Netanyahu angered President Barack Obama. There was another time where Netanyahu marched into the Oval Office and lectured President Obama in front of all the cameras in the Oval Office that Israel would never return to the lines of 1967 and give a Palestinian state in those lines. And so Democrats said that Netanyahu ruined the relationship between Democrats and Israel, and essentially remove bipartisan support for the state of Israel. And at the same time, Republicans, really latched on to the banner of Israel support. So you have, on the one hand, Netanyahu angering Obama and Democrats, and Republicans and Trump loving Israel. So for Democrats and progressives, well, if Netanyahu angered Obama and Trump loves Israel, then loving Israel must be bad, right? And so they seek to harm Israel's standing that was achieved under the Trump administration. Now, Lapid, who works with a Democratic Party pollster, is trying to now repair the relationship with Democrats, okay, who now control the White House, the Senate, and the Congress. And Blinken is coming over and talking to Lapid and telling him, listen, if you want to fix the relationship, these are the things that we need to do. And one of those things is to reopen the consulate to the Palestinians, which the Trump administration shuttered. And so Lapid is falling for the nonsense and wants to repair the relationship, whatever that means, and would 100% be willing to open up this consulate once again to the Palestinians. And so the question is, will Bennett, who ran as a right-winger, yet really told his entire base that he wouldn't sit with the left, that he wouldn't sit with Lapid, said not in a rotation, not in out without a rotation, who now sits with Lapid in a rotation. Remember, Lapid is going to be the prime minister in August of 2023 if this government holds. So what it looks like is happening right now is the United States and Lapid are looking for what you'd call trust-building measures, right? That might Lapid was just in Europe this week, and he acknowledged that he favors a two-state solution, but that the conditions for such negotiations or talks currently don't exist. So the question for Democrats is, how do you create that trust and those conditions that would make it possible for Palestinians to come to the table and to discuss slashing the state of Israel to pieces and creating a Palestinian state, right? So this might be one of those ways. So for someone like Bennett, who had previously pushed Israel to annex or apply Israeli sovereignty in all of Area C, which goes throughout throughout most of Judea and Samaria, will he get into a tussle with Lapid, who controls the foreign affairs of the country right now and is the prime minister in waiting? And the answer is, we have to see, but there's good reason to suspect that he might not, because right now his whole voter base is upset that he went against his promise. I mean, he literally signed a piece of paper and held it up to the TV, said, I will not sit with Lapid, I will not sit with the left. And then he ran ahead and did that, proving to everybody that that was his plan the entire time to do that. But that he had to make those promises, because if he didn't make those promises, he might not have even crossed the threshold and got into the Knesset to begin with, right? So he used his right-wing base, lied to them in order to go sit with the left, get the seat of prime minister. And so what he has to do is he's got to glue himself to this chair of prime minister. He has no place to go. If he'll go to elections, he'll be a tiny party, if a party at all. Lapid, on the other hand, if he went to elections, his 17 seats, according to the latest polls, might go up to 23 seats or more, because he's now the champion opposition to Netanyahu on the right. So we have to see what Bennett will do, but his track record since getting into office, is very poor so far, both in terms of what he's done to get to office, and also to say that he wouldn't openly oppose the re-entry into the Iran nuclear deal. He basically last week said that Netanyahu did nothing to prevent Iran from nuclear breakout. So he's kind of turning the page. Him and Lapid are turning the page on what was a very successful foreign policy for Benjamin Netanyahu. A lot of people, had many issues with Netanyahu and his governance, but in terms of his diplomatic stature and Israel's position in the world, most people thought that Netanyahu was doing a good job over there. So why Bennett and Lapid would seek to take the agreed upon strength of Netanyahu and to do a 180-degree turn, and to do that turn towards the Democrats, which are now harming Israeli interests, across the region, it's very puzzling.
And this is all while Bennett keeps on saying, this government is not going to deal with contentious issues. We're just going to deal with the civil society issues that need to be dealt with. As if you can run a country, and especially a country like Israel, under immense international pressures where things are happening on a geopolitical stage every day concerning our neighbors, as if you can't do anything and just lay things without making any decision whatsoever during 4 years of a government.
Well, what that means is that he recognizes that this disparate coalition cannot pass legislation, right? It has no chance of passing any controversial legislation because the parties don't really agree on too much, except that they didn't want Netanyahu to be the prime minister. So the government's not going to pass controversial legislation, but with regard to anything that doesn't require legislation, you could expect that this government will take as many decisions as it can by what you'd call executive order.
Alex Traiman, thank you so much for your insight on this issue. And I guess here, as we sit on this 9th of Av, the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av, connecting with thousands of years of memories, of sad memories, of the destruction of Jerusalem, of the temples, of calamities upon the Jewish people, to think that here we are, after 4 years of true progress for the benefit of the state of Israel and the and Israel's capital, Jerusalem, and truly moving forward with peaceful relations with our moderate Arab Muslim neighbors, to think that right now we are in danger of all that being rolled back, and especially Jerusalem on this 9th of Av, very, very concerning.
Agreed.
Thank you very, very much, and may you have a easy and meaningful fast, and may next 9th of Av, for those who do not know, this is a day that is a sad day because of our mourning, but one day will turn into a party when the redemption comes, when the third temple is rebuilt, and we hope that it didn't happen this year. We still have to fast, but let's hope we're partying up on the Temple Mount next year with the temple, Alex.
Amen. Thank you.
All right. All right, everyone, there you go. More very, very important insight. And again, a special important issue dealing with Jerusalem on this day when Jerusalem is on the minds of all Jews connected to their tradition and their heritage. Signing off for another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland. And again, you guys know that censorship on social media is growing. Listen, the Biden administration just said straight out last week they are working in tandem to knock down information, and censorship is growing day by day. The best way to continue receiving our videos is to go to our website, pulseofisrael.com, and to subscribe for our video newsletters. And if you're already a subscriber, then thank you. Shalom, shalom, everyone, from signing off from our eternal and ancestral homeland.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.